All right, we're recording. So, good morning, everyone. This is Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to the monthly ForestConnect webinar series, where we have an endless array of outstanding speakers. And today is no different. We're joined by Dr. Kevin Dodds. Kevin is an entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service. Kevin and I go way back in time to the early 90s at Frostburg State University. Then Kevin subsequently traveled about getting advanced graduate degrees, and now works for the U.S. Forest Service out of Durham, New Hampshire. And Kevin's been a presenter on the ForestConnect webinars before and always does a great job. Has really neat projects. So when he offered to talk about southern pine beetle in New York, I thought it'd be a great feature. So Kevin, I'm going to mute my microphone and just hover and enjoy your presentation. Thanks for joining us.
Great, thanks Pete, and I appreciate the invitation to talk to the group again. And it's great to see that it looks like we have a lot of people joining. So I've been looking forward to going over some of the work we've been doing in New York mostly. Some of my work is also outside of New York right now, trying to get a sense of what southern pine beetle may do in some other areas. But today, mostly what I'll concentrate on is the work we've been doing on the Long Island in the Central Pine Barrens. So I did want to take a minute or so to talk about the partners that are involved in this work. And as I go through the talk today, I'll be saying we a lot, and that really is a collective we. There's a lot of people that have been involved from numerous agencies in the response, in the response to southern pine beetle. And as you can imagine, when a pest like this invades an area, it really takes a lot of resources to deal with it. And you're asking individuals and agencies to come in and deal with this on top of their already busy workloads. And I think we were really effective at getting a team going right from the beginning, and a lot of the sort of the brunt of the work, of course, fell on New York DEC, and this was the Forest Health Group as well as the Region 1 folks down there, and they really have taken the lead with all of the management that we've been doing, and some of the survey work as well. New York State Parks had an early infestation, and so they were partners early on in coming up with the plan to deal with this, as were the Central Pine Barrens Commission. They've been important partners from the beginning, have helped with a lot of the field work as well as networking with some of the communities. Both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Park Service had some of the first infestations, and so we were dealing with suppression and management of southern pine beetle really early on federal lands, and so they were involved in creating kind of this management plan that we came up with together. And then the Brookhaven National Lab, they haven't really had an outbreak per se. There's been some trees killed by southern pine beetle on their property. But they certainly have some forests that would be conducive to promoting a southern pine beetle outbreak, and so we've worked closely with them as well. And then we've been fortunate to have really good university partners. Matt Ayers and Carissa Aoki from Dartmouth University have been a partner in this from the beginning. Matt has a long history with southern pine beetle, and then he and Carissa were working on southern pine beetle in New Jersey, in the Pinelands there, when southern pine beetle broke in Long Island. So they've been doing some work on Long Island as well. Dan Gilrain at Cornell University was one of the first people involved in this too, and helped get things going early on, and still is involved with extension outreach. And then recently, Tony D'Amato from University of Vermont and Jeff Garnis from University of New Hampshire have come on to try to answer some of the questions that we have of what southern pine beetle may be doing in some of these stands. And then finally, the local towns and villages on Long Island, as you can imagine, they really, are the ones facing the impact from this beetle, and they have the forests that are being managed or being suppressed. And so they've been, for the most part, really integral to dealing with the insect down there. So I thought I would just run through a couple slides really briefly to give you just a quick update on, or a quick background information on southern pine beetle in case you aren't really aware of the insect. And then we'll go into some more details as we go through. But you can see southern pine beetle is a small insect. It's smaller. This is a grain of rice here. And so you've got southern pine beetle, very small. This is a common insect that's found in the basal portions of trees, black turpentine beetle. If you're further north than Long Island, you would see the red turpentine beetle in some of these trees, but a very small beetle. It is a pest of hard pine. So if you think about the pines in the southeast, we're talking about loblolly pine, shortleaf, Virginia pine, slash pine. It'll go into longleaf pine as well. And it does attack living trees, and really that should be living, healthy trees. And if the population's high enough, the beetles can overwhelm even the healthiest trees. And that's very much different than the typical beetles, bark beetles that we have in the Northeast, where we don't really have anything here that's nearly as aggressive as southern pine beetle is. And then it does cause rapid tree mortality, and I'm talking really weeks. Certainly within a month, you start to see crown fade. That would be, suggestive of a dead tree. And this can, when you think about something like some of the invasives in the area, like emerald ash borer, that can take a year or two to kill trees. Asian longhorn beetle can take 5, 6, 7 or more years to kill a tree. Southern pine beetle can do it very rapidly. The combination of its behavior as well as the fungi that it inoculates into the tree do this. And so really quickly, you can have thousands or tens of thousands of trees killed in a stand. And this is partly due to the fact that it also has multiple generations. And so really quickly in an area, you can have a lot of tree mortality. Something completely different than what we're used to up here, even in the worst cases with some of our invasive species. And I'll be talking a little bit about spot growth and infestations, and spot is just kind of the common term we use for an infestation. But if you look at this image, you'll see, and this is all within one season of, within one summer season, all of these faded trees are affected by southern pine beetle. And you get a situation with the multiple generations are coming out and attacking adjacent trees. And so you'll have the initial attacks that in this shot, these are sort of the gray top trees back here, where all of the brood has now emerged from and moved into kind of the second wave of trees, which could be, red crown, and sometimes, depending on temperature and local environment, yellow or reddish. And so these trees are, at this moment in time, are full of brood, but they're now have fully developed. So they take a little bit over a month to develop in the tree. This is in the southeast anyways. And those trees those brood are now emerging, and they're attacking trees in the active front. And so these sort of green trees that'll just begin to fade out here are just now undergoing attack by southern pine beetle. So you can see this whole area is impacted in one season, and then the beetles will continue to move out in this active front area attacking trees. So these trees will develop, or the beetles in the trees will develop, and they'll attack trees out here, and it'll just go on until the temperature gets cold enough that they shut down. Surprise on the distribution, southern pine beetles primarily in the southeastern U.S. And you think about states or portions of states like East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama have traditionally had or historically had pretty significant outbreaks, periodic outbreaks of southern pine beetle where there's a lot of damage. But really this whole area will have outbreak level populations at different times of the year. Even as you move north up into North Carolina and Virginia, while the infestations may not be as frequent, they are still pretty severe at times. And you can see this is sort of the traditional or historic range, and we cut across Pennsylvania and into New Jersey, and this is where pretty much everybody just kind of viewed where southern pine beetle was. But then recently, there's been a bit of an expansion, and this figure just sort of shows what we think is going to happen. And southern pine beetle has been climatically restricted in its distribution, but with the warming temperatures, we're seeing this expansion into, we have it in Long Island, and we're predicting that we'll see it expand even further. And you can see this is a line that, by 2020, we expect to see the potential anyways for established populations in a lot of coastal New England. And by 2050, that line expands that area as well. So, we knew we had the potential to have the insect. And so New Jersey is kind of an interesting situation. It was a known portion of the distribution, but I think the kind of way that I look at it is there's been a recent expansion in damage, and certainly over the last decade or so, there's been persistent populations that have caused a lot of tree mortality, probably more severe than any historic records would say. So again, New Jersey was part of the range, but you didn't really see damaging populations to the level that we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years. So I think, at least for me anyways, it wasn't a big surprise to find southern pine beetle on Long Island. We'd had some discussions about it through the years based on New Jersey, but I will say this, I was surprised that it happened so fast. I was thinking out, maybe within the next 10 years or something, we might see some activity, but it was a little surprising how quickly it happened. And just to give you an idea of how the detections occurred, some suspect trees were located at multiple sites in the fall of 2014. And we started getting, there's some emails going around with pictures and some suggestion that there was some tree mortality at a number of sites. And so based on site visits that we conducted and collection of beetles, we confirmed southern pine beetle on Long Island in October 2014. And that was at multiple sites. We spent some more time that fall just getting out to different areas and getting a sense of, okay, this is southern pine beetle, this is not. And then the next step was New York State flew an aerial detection survey in the winter of 2014, 2015 and mapped some potential damage on the landscape. And these were just some of the signs that we were looking at, just to give you an idea as we move through the talk and talk about host defenses and stuff. But you can see, this is resin that the tree is pushing out to try to evict southern pine beetle. And you can see here's a southern pine beetle that's dead. There's one here and one in here as well. And so they've been pushed out successfully by the tree. And that's the sort of the first line of response that the tree does. But this tree did die from southern pine beetle. These were just some of the unfortunate early invaders that lost the sort of battle to get into the tree. And this is just a close-up of this. Some people, if you've worked in the Southeast on southern pine beetle or been out on a tour down there or anything, a lot of people refer to this as popcorn because from a distance it does kind of look like popcorn on the bark of trees. But there's a good shot of an adult southern pine beetle that was pitched out and died in the hardening resin. This was this is a simplified version of the aerial detection survey map from that winter survey that DEC conducted, and I just took the polygons and made them into centroids essentially, and you can see, so from the air that first winter, we already had an indication that we had a population that was somewhat widespread, but I think we all were a little bit surprised of the amount of damage that was mapped from the air. And the damage is based on crown fade. So at that point, you don't know that all of these are southern pine beetle. The trees could have died from something else and faded. But after the ground surveys of these sites, the majority of these were in fact southern pine beetle. So, we knew we had a pretty large area that was infested with southern pine beetle and a large population that we were going to have to deal with. So based on that, one thing we initially were worried about was, well, wow, if it's this established in Long Island, how much further had it gone? And sort of quickly in that winter of 2015, Connecticut also found some infested trees. So we used some detection traps out on the landscape, working with all of our state partners. And on this map, the blue triangles are traps that were not positive for southern pine beetle, and the red dots are traps that were positive for southern pine beetle. So not a huge surprise, obviously Long Island, even some of these catches where the beetle is creeping into upstate New York. This was a little bit of a surprise in northern Connecticut. And then this, to me, was a big surprise. This is the Montague Plains, where we caught a number of beetles that first year of trapping. And then, of course, along the Cape, we had some too, and throughout Rhode Island. The important thing with this, or these types of data, is that these traps only mean that the beetle was moving into the area. It does not mean, as odd as this will sound, that there was established populations nearby. It's not that southern pine beetle has a huge dispersal potential on its own, but bark beetles can get up into the prevailing winds and be pushed into different areas. And so we don't know, that there's an infestation anywhere around here. There's been no sign of that through aerial surveys or further trapping. And in fact, we have never found any infested trees in Massachusetts, even with all the effort the state's been putting in to make sure they're going to find something early. So I'm just going to run through the last 3 years. These are the aerial detection survey maps. So just to give you an idea of the how persistent the insect's been. Central Pine Barrens are in this area, and so you can see a lot of activity there. In 2016, I think we started to get a little bit more activity into the eastern portion of Long Island. 2017, I think, this looks a little bit better, but there was still a lot of mortality out on that landscape and a lot of sites that had to be suppressed. So still a fair bit of southern pine beetle activity, even if it doesn't look quite as dramatic as it did in 2015 and 16. And then last year, kind of the same pattern from 2 years before this, where we got a little bit more activity moving into eastern Long Island and not as much happening back here in the west. And these are some of the early infestations were around the Sayville and Patch Hog area in Shirley. So I think, for me in my role here, we've gotten a couple hard pine pests that have moved in, Cyrex wood wasp, a few years before my time, pine shoot beetle. And there's generally kind of almost an apathy to, hard pine pests in the Northeast, because we don't really, in a sense, have the large economic resource of the pine stands. But southern pine beetle is a different kind of pest, and the threat that it poses to pine barrens, which are high ecological value, is significant. And what we can expect to see, and what we are seeing, is a rapid shift in tree species composition. So, we're losing overstory pine in stands, and then the, sort of mid canopy, intermediate trees and sometimes codominant hardwoods are then taking over. And obviously all of that mortality quickly changes the structure of a stand as well. And then when you open up a canopy like that, either through mortality caused by southern pine beetle or our suppression activities, you can expect to see a lot of understory changes. You certainly open up the potential for invasive species to move in. Increase fuels, either the trees that are standing that eventually fall, or when we do our suppression activities, we put all that material on the ground. Of course, you upend management plans. Especially some of the property on federal lands, you may be managing that property for endangered species or species of concern, and you have this dramatic shift in stand structure and species composition. You may lose habitat for some of these species. Give you a sense of what we're seeing. This is data from one of the first stands we surveyed. I think it was about an 80-acre stand on the Wertheim. And so you can see how important pitch pine is in the stand. In terms of importance value, pitch pine was the most important species in there. And the majority of the larger size classes were pitch pine. And southern pine beetle arrived when we did our sampling at the end of that season. I think something like 98% of the pitch pine was dead there. And so we moved this stand into really just a hardwood dominated, mixed oak stand on that site. And certainly lost some of those pitch pine were, I don't normally talk about super dominant and canopy layers, but some of those pitch pine were well above the primary canopy layer, and so you lose that structure really rapidly. This is again within we started working in that site in October, and southern pine beetle had done all of that we don't know when it started that summer, but it had all occurred within the previous 3 or at most 4 months. So a lot of quick damage on the landscape. And this is just to give you an indication of how many trees we were losing. This is again from Wertheim. The SPB attack trees. It's very rare for a tree to survive a southern pine beetle attack when there's outbreak populations like we were dealing with. So you have some background mortality in the stand. Those trees are already dead, but you can add these trees to the dead column as well. And so you can see again just a huge amount of tree mortality, and then having to deal with that amount of wood that's out there, either standing or getting it down. And there, the Wertheim is a heavily visited national wildlife refuge. So there's trails going through these areas that they had to go in and clean up and take out a lot of hazard trees. So the hard pine species that we're worried about, or that we think about anyways, for for the Northeast, and obviously primarily pitch pine, and there's a legacy of attack with southern pine beetle there. Red pine, very restricted in the Northeast. We've lost a lot of it. What was around still recently because of red pine scale and some fungal foliar pathogens, we think. And then jack pine, very restricted distribution, but important in some of the coastal areas. And, so all of these have the potential to sustain southern pine beetle. I think red pine, we have some natural communities of red pine that are pretty rare that we would hate to see get hit by southern pine beetle. But definitely the tree that is the most worrisome right now is pitch pine, certainly on Long Island, but also on the Cape. When you move into Massachusetts, there's a lot of pitch pine sitting out there. So we always get the question about white pine, and so there is information out there that when southern pine beetle has encountered white pine in the southeast, it has killed it. There's no real data though that no comparisons between let's say emergence of white pine versus loblolly pine or anything like that. So we just know that it is a potential host. And what we were seeing early on were a lot of trees like this, and there's not a lot of white pine that we run into in Long Island, but when we would see them, they would be heavily hit by southern pine beetle. They always stick out because everybody knows how resinous white pine is. But when you would cut into these trees at the attack sites, you generally didn't see any success. And so that was good news, and we kind of were living that way, thinking that for a year or two. Last year, out in the Hamptons, we pulled some white pine, and this is a bark sample from one. And we started to see a little bit more gallery development. And just if you're unfamiliar with southern pine beetle or bark beetles, this line here is a parent gallery. So the female enters the phloem, chews that, lays. You can actually see there's an egg niche and there's an egg niche. She'll lay eggs there. They then hatch out, and these little lines here are the larval mines that come off of it. This is actually an unsuccessful gallery. You can see resin is in there, and that's why you don't really see any larval mines coming off of it. A little bit more success over here, but these larvae would never really go anywhere. And so we thought, okay, something's occurring in those trees that's knocking them back. And that was the story until this year. Jessica Cancelera at New York DEC and some others brought in some white pine logs from this same site, but attacked a year later. And they actually got emergence, and pretty abundant emergence of southern pine beetle. So again, not a surprise in a way. I mean, we knew that it was possible, but it was kind of a bummer to hear that because we had seen mostly unsuccessful attacks on it. So still don't know until we are in a situation where we can do some research on it. How good of a host is white pine compared to pitch pine? And we don't have that answer right now. My sense is that, it's a host that'll get taken, but whether or not it'll sustain a large outbreak would be something we'd have to see. So I just want to run through, some of the biology and how the trees deal with southern pine beetle. So you saw the first picture. It's a small beetle, less than 3 millimeters, and it certainly doesn't get by killing trees on its own. It has to mass attack, and it does this through a complex pheromone system I'll talk about in a second. And so, a tree, an insect attacks a tree, brings in others from the surrounding area, and they're able to overwhelm the host defenses of that tree. Once in the tree, it feeds in that phloem that I just showed you, creating those galleries. The larvae feed in the phloem through their development. They inoculate fungi, which is a food source as well. And then again, that key factor for why this is such a pest is the multiple generations. And in the Southeast, you can have 7, 8 generations a year. We're certainly not getting that in the Northeast. I think we're probably closer to somewhere between 3 and 4, or actually probably somewhere between 2 and 4, depending on how warm our falls is. But what's been weird so far in New York is we're getting southern pine beetle activity all the way into December, and that's unusual based on what the temperatures have been at times. Pheromones, and these are the same compounds that we use to monitor the beetles, but and these are key to why southern pine beetle is so damaging. They have a very effective aggregation pheromone or pheromones, and that coupled with host volatiles is what really draws in these beetles to a tree. So you have a tree on the landscape that gets attacked. The initial beetles release the aggregation pheromones. They're chewing into the bark. That releases more host volatiles. And that really just brings in any of the or southern pine beetle that are in the surrounding area, and it concentrates attack on that tree. And so by doing that, it allows the beetles to overwhelm the host defenses. So even the healthiest tree, if you have a large population of southern pine beetle in the area, they'll overcome that tree and kill it. At some point in that attack process, though, the pheromone composition starts to shift more into anti-aggregation, and it does this because there's a limited amount of resources on that tree, and if you get too high level of attacks in those trees, you actually get reduced brood production. So the anti-aggregation pheromone is a signal to incoming beetles that essentially saying, hey, this tree's full, and it shifts attacks to nearby trees, and that's how you get that spot formation. And so the adjacent trees then become the focus of attack. Other beetles concentrate on that, and then the anti-aggregation pheromones kick in and move it to the next tree. And so it just goes kind of on and on like that. But it's not all sunny and happy times for southern pine beetle with the pheromones, because the predators and competitors do cue on these as well as pheromones. And so this beetle down here is a primary, it's Thanasimus dubius, a primary predator of southern pine beetle. And it arrives at the trees, almost, it feels like simultaneous to southern pine beetle, but it's certainly right after the attack process starts. And you'll see clarets, that's the family Claridae, running all around, on these freshly attacked trees. And they're looking for, arriving adult southern pine beetle. They feed on them, and then they also lay their eggs in the host trees, and their larvae feed on southern pine beetle larvae in those host trees. So you get kind of a double impact from them. And then this may be a beetle you're familiar with. It's a Sawyer beetle, and at least in the Southeast, these are important as well because they're competitors to southern pine beetle, and they get in and they feed in that phloem, and they're very destructive feeders in a way. So they make really big mines, and they'll just chew right through southern pine beetle brood if the timing is correct. So they can be quite damaging to southern pine beetle as well. I'm not going to talk a lot about the fungi, but I wanted to mention it. So southern pine beetle carries beneficial fungi. They carry them in a specialized structure called a mycangia, where they're housed and nourished, and then they're inoculated into the phloem during the invasion. And then on their bodies is an antagonistic fungus, a blue stain fungus, that's on their bodies, and then on the bodies of mites that are on the bodies of southern pine beetle. So it's a very interesting system. But this bark sample that I took from the Wertheim really really demonstrates kind of what goes on with the fungi pretty well. And so you can see in this middle area, this is where blue stain got established. There are some southern pine beetle galleries there, but very small brood. There's a larva there and a larva there. But if you look outside of this on each side, this is where the mycangial fungi became established. And you can see clear phloem, but look at the size difference of the brood, and you've got a lot higher density of brood. All through here are larvae that are just feeding just under the phloem surface. So, you know, a lot of brood production here, limited brood production here. And this is, you know, the sort of percentage of these fungi in an outbreak population can have an impact on you know, some level of control of that population as well, or an influence on that population. And so the trees, I talked about this a little bit, they're not sitting out there defenseless. They do have a, you know, preformed defense, and that's the resin. That's the primary defense that hits the first, and, you know, anytime the bark and the phloem is disturbed, the tree is going to push resin. There's also an induced response that forms around that wound to try to block off any fungal invasion. It floods the area with different chemicals. And these are, for the most part, it's somewhat nuanced, but for the most part, these are tied to tree vigor. So, you know, healthier trees are better able to defend themselves. And tree vigor, with a lot of our pines and how it relates to southern pine beetle, is really tied to stand structure and disturbance, recent disturbance in those stands. But probably the most important factor for southern pine beetle is that stand structure and how healthy that stand is and whether it's been managed or not. And so this is a shot from, I believe this is from East Texas during the 90s. And I just wanted to show it to give you a sense of, you know, how large of an area can be affected by southern pine beetle if suitable hosts are out on the environment. And this is probably most likely in loblolly or shortleaf pine. And so you can see, I mean, this is, again, within one season, all of this damage occurred. So it can be a very dramatic impact to an area. Our landscapes on Long Island in particular aren't in a way conducive to that. You know, we have a lot of fragmentation, which is beneficial when you, in this case anyways, when you're fighting an insect like southern pine beetle. And so, you know, I don't see that we would have these large areas that are going to get lost, but what we certainly do have is a lot of forests on the landscape that are highly susceptible to southern pine beetle. And so what are some of the stand characteristics that really benefit southern pine beetle? So what stand characteristics make a stand highly susceptible to southern pine beetle? And a lot can go into this, but the key ones really are overstocked stands, so high basal area. If you have trees of larger diameter, that can be really beneficial for southern pine beetle. Closed canopies are important. They keep the pheromone signals down so that the beetles are able to find their next tree to hit. Poor soils has been implicated in southern pine beetle susceptibility in a stand. And same with drought. Drought is a little bit more nuanced too, but it can be a factor for sure on the landscape in terms of whether southern pine beetle will do good in a stand or not, or in an area, region. And so what are the conditions of pitch pine on Long Island? And if you've been down there, it's clear that nobody's done any management in these stands since stand initiation, really. And so I think, you know, I've been working down there now for, 4 years or whatever, and I've never seen a managed stand other than ones that we're working in. There is some fire, you know, prescribed fire here and there, but in general, you know, most of these stands haven't been touched. So they're very overstocked, oak dominated for the most part, understory and mid canopy. And again, I would say in a lot of the stands that I've visited anyways, that oak canopy is already moving up into that codom layer. And then the disappointing thing when you think about losing your overstory pines to southern pine beetle is that there is limited to no pine regeneration. And I mean, we certainly see some stands that have pine regeneration, but in general, when you're walking around these stands and some that we've sampled, you're just not really seeing any pine regeneration to speak of. And there are some great exceptions if you're interested in seeing pine barrens and aggressively managed pine barrens in the Montague Plains in Massachusetts. The Albany pine bush are great examples. Miles Standish in State Forest in Massachusetts is starting to do some restoration as well. But these are exceptions, and certainly the general condition of pitch pine on Long Island is the condition is not favorable to knocking back southern pine beetle. And so we're fortunate with southern pine beetle that there's been a long history, decades and decades of research on the insect. And the Forest Service has a research group in Pineville, Louisiana, that's been established for a long time, and they've done a ton of good work. Some of the big bug projects that were out in the 70s, there was one for southern pine beetle, and so that helped establish a lot of academics throughout the Southeast that set up labs and have worked on southern pine beetle for 30 plus years. So we're not in a situation like we were for Asian longhorn beetle or emerald ash borer or some of these other pests that come through, where we don't really, we have to start observing the insect and come up with ideas to treat it. We have tools that we think will translate really well to the Northeast, and we've been implementing them over the last couple years. And so I'm going to talk about three components of integrated pest management that we're using. The survey and monitoring, of course, that's key. You have to know where the insect is, is it in an area that's threatening a resource you care about. Suppression of active infestations. We have the ability to knock back populations in some of these infestations. So that's an important tool to be used. And then I think the key and how this relates into, maybe conservation and restoration of pine barrens is prevention for southern pine beetle is pretty aggressive at times. Silvicultural treatments, as well as if the circumstances are right, getting in prescribed fire as well. So the tools we've used for surveying are pretty straightforward. I've touched on these already, but we use the pheromones along with multiple funnel traps in most cases. And, we use these to either monitor established populations that we know about, or we put them out on the fringes where we try to detect new populations moving into an area. And as I mentioned when I talked about the pheromones, these are really strong attractants. So it's not like some of the lures we use up here for other insects. These really bring in the beetles if they're in the area. And then once you have southern pine beetle, you really move into a situation where you have to get up in the air and do the aerial detection surveys. And these are generally run, 3 or 4 times a year. I think New York may be doing them 5 or 6 times. You start at the beginning of the growing season and move through that summer into the fall, because you always have a continuum of tree fade that's popping up. And so the observers just map that tree fade, and then that's followed up by ground surveys to get out into the sites to see exactly how many trees are attacked, what stages they're in, and get a sense of if that's an area you want to manage or not, try to suppress. So I mentioned having a good solid tool, and that's for suppression, and that's cut and leave and cut and remove treatments. And the gist of this is you're going into the stands, marking the trees that are attacked, and then you're felling them sort of in on themselves. So everything kind of towards the center of the infestation, if that's possible. It's certainly possible in the Southeast. It's a little bit more confusing to do that in the Northeast because of how the beetle's behaving, and then all of the hardwoods in there. But either way, you're dropping the trees back on themselves. With cut and leave, you're leaving all that material on the ground. And then with cut and remove, it's essentially a salvage removal. No surprise to anyone, there's no forest industry on Long Island, so we haven't been able to do any real cut and removes and sell that wood or get any type of money back. So pretty much everything we've done on Long Island has been cut and leave, and these are just a couple shots from federal land. And in the South, the trees are felled and not a lot's done with it. We were doing some late fall treatments, and so we wanted to buck the material up a little bit more with the hope that would expose the brood to winter temperatures and knock back the population that way. What's interesting is, the mechanism for disruption here, you're probably thinking, yeah, okay, the trees are down on the ground, the brood dies, but that's not really the case. And you can get, 70 or 80% brood emergence from these down trees. So you still have a large source of beetles, but what you've done by cutting all of the infested trees, and then you also cut a a green buffer strip as well. And so by doing that, you've knocked out any pheromone signal and you've opened up the canopy so those pheromones just sort of plume out. So the beetles that do survive in the down material, when they emerge to go attack a new tree, they can't find a signal. And so it's thought that they just disperse off and die. And so in the summer months, southern pine beetles biology is not really conducive to long range dispersal. So most of those beetles just die. There's no evidence that knocking down, a spot here creates, 7 or 8 more spots. That's known as spot proliferation. And we don't really see that, so it's a good tool and you can effectively knock down a population in an area. This is a shot that Andy Drake out in East Hampton took using a drone, and I like seeing it because you never get to see suppression from above, and I thought it would be a good ad just to give you an idea of the disruption of the canopy, and also there's a lot of wood down on the ground, and this is just one little section of a large suppression effort that went on out in the East Hamptons, and this is also where we got those white pines that were attacked, and so it was white pine was intermixed with pitch pine, and the pitch pine were getting hammered. So you can see a lot of wood is put down on the ground, the canopy's opened, and as you can imagine, there'll be a understory response in there, and just very different conditions after suppression. And then, so the last tool, and I think it's really the key, and this again ties into especially restoration, is stand thinning. And you get kind of a dual response. You get the tree and the stand response. At the tree level, the residual trees, of course, have reduced competition, and the idea being that they would, increase their vigor. That would lead to better resin defenses or just better host tree defenses. And then at the stand level, you're reducing that stand susceptibility. So southern pine beetle might still get in that stand, but you wouldn't expect the same level of damage as you would see in, say, an unmanaged stand where the beetle could just grow those infestations. And the key, I think that one of the key parts of this is at the stand level, the thinning is opening up that canopy, and that promotes disruption of the pheromone plumes. And so when the beetles emerge from a tree and go to find that next attack tree, the pheromones getting either plumed out straight up or just getting disrupted. And so and you've increased the inner tree distance between the pine trees as well, and just makes it harder for them to find the next host tree to attack. And that's an important part of that. And so here's just a couple shots I'm going to run through. And I think, this is the typical scenario that we're working in on Long Island. And, obviously overstocked, a lot of hardwoods. And I'm not suggesting that, we need to get all of these types of stands to something like this. This is a shot from Montague of, an incredible restoration and a great stand. When you look at these inner tree distances, southern pine beetle might hit a tree in there, but it's certainly, you would not expect it to grow an infestation like you would here. But even getting into stands like this and reducing that basal area would be beneficial. You may not make it as low susceptibility as some other treatments, but you're still lowering the chance for damage in those stands. And there's a lot of stands like this on Long Island. I was visiting Miles Standish for a field tour, a patho tour, and this was one of the stops, and this is a recent restoration down there. And again, it's dramatic compared to what we see on Long Island, but very low susceptibility to southern pine beetle, and they're kind of expanding this cut, I believe, as well. So kind of cool to see it. And then we're doing some work in Rocky Point, Pine Barren State Forest, where we've put in a demo, and I'll show a little bit more on this. And I think in this shot, I'm standing, back here in one of the untreated areas, shooting across one of our treatment blocks. And certainly we, I think dramatically, you could say, opened up the overstory here. Some of the cuts don't look this open, and but they're, we cut back the basal area almost by half, I believe, and really I think are over the next couple of years we'll see that this is favorable for reducing southern pine beetle activity. And this is just kind of our layout. New York DC did a great job of getting this in. If this had been federal land and us trying to run it through the Forest Service, it would have taken a long time, I think, to get established. But we pretty much got it established the year we started talking about it. And so we have a demonstration forest set up now. And each of these blocks up here are 3 acres, and we have controls, and then blocks that we thinned, and then blocks that were thinned and will be burned as well. They haven't been burned yet, but we hope to get that done this year. And then so shortly after that, we put in another set of blocks down the road. So we have 2 areas that, we're seeing them as sort of experimental forests that will be out there if other people are interested or have questions to answer that maybe our treatments would be helpful for them. They'd be welcome to do some work in there as well. And then we'll be monitoring it, in the coming years to see if we see any southern pine beetle activity in those areas. So just to kind of tie this all together, how southern pine beetle manage and pine barrens restoration, I think, really go hand in hand. Stands that are less susceptible to southern pine beetle, again, have that, lower stem density and lower basal area, and you have these more widely spaced trees. You've got open crown conditions, so you've really disrupted that canopy and opened it up. And then maybe not as important, but still a component, is reduced competition in the understory. And as you can see, that ties right into some of the pine barrens restoration tools, and where you want to reduce that overstory. And again, some of those previous pictures showed how dramatic that can be. And then the widely spaced overstory trees, you're just not going to see southern pine beetle grow an infestation in those types of stands. Open crowns, which again, same for less susceptible southern pine beetle stands. And then, with pine barrens restoration, of course, it's important to get understory vegetation management, mostly through fire, but sometimes using some other tools as well. So this is kind of how I've been selling it, and others have been talking about as well, is that, we need to go in and reduce susceptibility to southern pine beetle, but it also gives us a potential to maybe get some of those pine barren or stands that are on the pine barrens, the central pine barrens, a little bit more closer to their sort of natural state, if you want to look at it that way. So I think with that, I'm happy to take questions. My contact information's down there. I'm happy to take emails if you don't get a question in today, or you think about something later, or you can call me at that number as well.
Kevin, great presentation. That was very cool. I didn't know. I mean, I've heard about southern pine beetle from forestry school days, but I've never seen one and just never really had any exposure. And I was aware of it as it was happening over the last couple of years, but this was, I think, a great job of tying it all together. So usually I'll take a host prerogative and give you some questions, but there have been so many questions come in.
Okay.
I'll leave those for the audience, and I'll ask mine at the end as time permits.
Okay.
Do you want me to read the questions, or can you see the chat panel?
I actually don't.
What's easiest for you?
I think maybe if you read them, just to organize it better. Yeah, I'll probably be all over the place if I did it.
All right. So let me go back here. First one, I think you mentioned. Well, not directly. So you talked about the range of red pine, but is it known if southern pine beetle will attack red pine?
It is, yeah. And I look at any of the hard pines as being hosts, and certainly something like jack pine, when you think about the conditions that, and how jack pine develops, that's a stand type that would be very high risk to southern pine beetle. Red pine has been attacked and successfully produced brood on some some sort of these remnant plantations in Connecticut. So there is evidence of it emerging from red pine.
Okay. So as I'm reading these questions, you ended up answering some of them, which means that your anticipation or the topics you covered were right on spot. So Tom Ward was asking about the condition of pitch pine stands that have been attacked in terms of basal area and age, whether there are opportunities to improve tree vigor and beetle resistance with management. So I feel like you covered that. I don't know if you want to add
Yep.
any more. Okay.
I mean, I can give a little bit of background on the condition, when we're going into them, and I haven't looked at some of this data in a couple of years, but, a lot of the stands where we did do some coring, I think we were at like 65, 70 years, somewhere around there. Basal area, in terms of English units, I think, up well over 140, 160 at times. We were, for our treatments, we were taking it back to around 80 for at that Rocky Point demo site that I showed. So very, very heavily stocked. I think some of the sites are well beyond that too. And the thing with southern pine beetle that you don't see with some other beetles is that it will really take any tree size too. So, larger, some of these, there's some amazing pitch pine in terms of diameter and height in some of these stands, and we just see some of those riddled by southern pine beetle. And then you also see it in some of the sort of intermediate and overtopped tree diameters as well.
Okay. And Ray Brown asked about white pine, and you confirmed that it will infest and kill white pine.
Yeah, and I'll just add really quickly, the information from the Southeast is very limited because there's just not a lot of white pine. But I think it was a stand in North Carolina, and what's written about it is that southern pine beetle was in an outbreak. It hit a white pine stand that was sizable, and there was evidence that white pine maintained the infestation, which means that there was multiple generations that occurred in there. So that's kind of what we were looking at, or our kind of background information when we were seeing attacks on Long Island, and we just originally weren't seeing a lot of success. So my feeling is that it'll sustain a population, but I don't think it's going to put out the number of beetles as you see in pitch pine. And just, I didn't have a good shot of this, but if you look at, a pitch pine gallery or a sample from pitch pine that's been attacked, and you put that next to those white pine, you just have such a higher density of brood in those pitch pine. And so, if it does expand into areas where we have a lot of stressed white pine, which there's certainly a lot of that on the landscape, and it's not managed and overstocked and all, and the conditions are right, I think we certainly could have an outbreak in white pine. I just don't know that it would be as damaging as you'd see in a hard pine stand.
Okay. Lucy asks, is the beetle moving, or is the move east of beetles on Long Island due to wind? And then a follow-up to that, how do those beetles extend their territories?
Yeah, I don't think it's through wind. Wind, it's wind-aided dispersal. Would that be the right way to say it? So, they do have the ability to fly. For little beetles, they're relatively strong flyers. I worked on Douglas fir beetle out west, and it's a little bit larger dendroctonus. But some of the flight mill work on those had those beetles dispersing 7, 8, 9 miles at one point, in one time. So, and then mountain pine beetle is recorded to have really large dispersal events because it gets up and gets carried by the wind. So I don't know if the prevailing winds or anything like that or what's moving it. I think that southern pine beetle is essentially all throughout Long Island, and in those areas, when it started flagging further east, there was probably already populations there that just weren't killing large enough number of trees to be mapped by the air. That would be that's my guess of that. I can't remember the second part. Was there a second part to that?
So essentially, I think you covered it. How do beetles extend their territories? Yeah,
so it's an interesting beetle. During the summer, well, I'll start with the fall or spring. It's in a dispersal mode, so the beetles that emerge have a higher fat reserve, and that's what they use those lipids to burn off as they disperse. So they're not really wired at that time to cue to pheromones, right? So they're dispersing out. they're attacking the new trees, then they're releasing pheromones and bringing other beetles in. Once the spot or the infestation is initiated, the biology of the beetle changes a little bit, where the beetles that are developing have lower lipid levels or fat levels or energy levels, and they're not really wired at that point, or most of the population is not wired at that point to disperse, and that's why you get spot growth. They're going to come out, go to the next trees. Maybe 5 or 10% of that population may disperse out, but the primary behavior that you see then is spot growth. When we look for new infestations, you look to see how those occurring more in the fall and in the spring. In the fall, the beetles are dispersing to find overwintering trees. In the spring, they're dispersing from those trees to initiate new infestations, and they have a stronger ability to fly in the fall or spring.
Okay, that's pretty cool. All right. Tom Ward asks whether there's efforts to diversify age structure in pine stands, or maybe if a diversified age structure would affect the likelihood of infestation.
That's a good question. I mean, I don't really think about it as diversifying the age structure. It's really, not any size, but a couple inches and up are suitable hosts for southern pine beetle. So it's really about opening up those stands, getting a lower basal area, less stress in the stand. And, you could do that through multiple techniques, if you wanted multiple age structure, or you could do that, that could be part of your plan. But the key would be to lower the basal area and open up the site.
Okay. And the opening of the site is to allow the pheromones to disperse.
It is, I think originally, and I haven't gone all the way back through kind of following the trajectory of some of this stuff, but, I think early on, the silvicultural treatments were looked at as, the benefit is you're improving the vigor of the trees, but that doesn't always translate to improving host defenses. And then there was some really interesting work in the early 2000s where some people followed trace gases through some of these stands, and it really became apparent that the disruption, opening up that stand, really disrupted that pheromone and allowed it to either plume out directly, or just get, I kind of think of it as getting it more jagged, where it was more difficult for the beetles to follow that signal kind of uphill to the host tree.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Does southern pine beetle affect table mountain pine, Pinus pungens, which is
it would. And I think I have read a paper, trying to remember where that was written from, where table mountain and pitch pine, I think, was in the same site or within the same kind of area that they were working, and there were attacks on it. So it would be a host, and if the structure of that stand was conducive to an outbreak, southern pine beetle would go through it.
So essentially, there are no pine trees in the east that would not be attacked by southern pine beetle.
Yeah, I don't think so. And southern pine beetle, it's been recorded in spruce at times, hemlock. I mean, and those, I don't take those hosts very seriously. Dan Gilrain found it in Norway spruce out on Long Island. I think Matt did as well. But I don't think that those are species we have to really worry about. There was a stand in Connecticut, a Norway spruce, that was supposedly hit by southern pine beetle. I didn't see it, but the people that were in there said that southern pine beetle was in there doing some damage. So, but yeah, for me, I look at, if you don't want the pine stand to get attacked by southern pine beetle, or if it does, you want to reduce the susceptibility of that. You can do that through silvicultural treatments and reducing the stand stress and opening that stand up. But yeah, I expect any pine to be attacked.
Okay. So Andrew S. says there's a large area in the West Hampton, Flanders location north of Gabrinsky Airport that was burned 15 to 18 years ago. Is anyone looking at this regenerated area to see if it's more or less susceptible to the beetles?
I don't know. I would love to have more details on that. So if you can email me more information on the site, I can look into that. I can say that we haven't. My group here has not, but there may be some others that have gone through that site. But I don't know of that area. So if you can email me, if you feel like it, email me details, and we can follow up and talk about it.
Okay. So Carl wants to know if you have any thoughts about the need for more biodiversity in the forest to prevent large-scale damage.
I mean, sure. You could that could certainly be somebody's approach. The key here for me is do people want to maintain pitch pine as a component of the pitch pine barrens? And if you do, you have to manage a certain way, increasing species richness and of overstory trees and things like that don't necessarily go hand in hand with conservation of the pine barrens and those types of stands. I mean, the forests that southern pine beetle has gone through. I showed those data from the Wertheim. That is now you could argue a more diverse forest in some ways because there's other hardwoods coming up, and it's not it's not susceptible to southern pine beetle at all, but it's a different forest type.
I guess the diversity is in the structural diversity. That's and right. The openness and the kind of the pattern of the forest. So.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Tim wants to know if there's any association of southern pine beetle or coincidence of southern pine beetle with oak wilt.
That's a good question. Not that I know of, but so oak wilt's been detected on Long Island in a number of places, and I don't know those exact locations compared to where we've been working, but there's been nothing that has come up about that in terms of our detection of oak wilt is actually right next to where we did some suppression or anything like that. But that's a good question, but I don't know at this point, and at least from the limited amount of detections that there are of oak wilt on Long Island, I would say that there is not an association right now, just because in talking to people, those seem to be in different areas than where we're working on southern pine beetle.
Okay. And there were a couple of questions about the role of fire and how fire, in what way was fire beneficial to management of southern pine beetle?
Yeah, so I see fire as that's an important factor in kind of maintaining pine barrens, right, and keeping the stands in a place where they're not getting overrun by oaks and getting a lot of competition in that understory that then grows up into, that mid canopy layer. So, when you have a stand that you can get fire back into that you've opened up, I think it's really a maintenance type issue that fire can be useful for doing that. And so, when you think about a lot of these stands, I mean, we're putting a ton of wood on the ground in some of our suppressions, and, you wouldn't want to go right back in there with fire, but hopefully we get to a place where we're thinning a little bit more, and then over time you can get prescribed fire back in there as a tool to keeping the stand structure in something more conducive to pine barrens, or not more conducive, but more closer to the natural state of pine barrens, which is also less susceptible to southern pine beetle.
Okay. Amanda wonders if there's when you create these openings in the canopy, if that subsequently produces problems with invasive plant introductions.
Yeah, and that's a good question. That's something we're worried about. We had a student. She just finished her master's last winter, I think, and she did some work in looking at, the impact of southern pine beetle on the forest, and then and also the impact of our suppression efforts. And she looked at understory communities. The problem with that work was, we were only 2 years in, and she didn't find an immediate response. There was a 2-year window where she didn't find this overwhelming effect of invasives moving in. It's certainly something that, intuitively you would expect to see. There's been some other vegetation responses, and that work is just in revision now for forest ecology and management, and I think that it'll go through fine this time. So hopefully in the next 6 months or so that would be out and available. But I think everybody working on this is kind of expecting that we're going to see a rush of invasives in there. And Molly Hoyce's work was that 2-year window, and there's Molly Hassett with DEC is running some similar plots that she's established, long-term monitoring plots throughout Long Island that she'll be following up on too. So we are concerned about it and monitoring it, but I think right now I can't say for sure what's going on.
Okay. How about wind throw with the widely spaced pines?
Yeah, that's a good question, and certainly something we were worried about. If you remember when was it, like March, I think it was March, we had those late nor'easters come through, and I've been monitoring other insects in these thinnings, because one thing that can happen is you put all this wood on the ground and you can build up Ips populations that then are as damaging to some of the residual trees as southern pine beetle would have been. And so I was down there pretty early, and there was in one of our thin blocks, there were some snapped trees, some of the residuals. It wasn't, there was two, I think I remember seeing 2 in 1 3-acre block, and I didn't see any anywhere else. I wasn't in every block that visit, but so we definitely had some, but those were also severe storms down there. One of those, I think, knocked out, power for multiple days to a lot of people and everything. So it is something we're worried about, but I guess in some ways too, like some of these trees were so stunted and, from their original growing conditions that maybe they're better able to handle it, because we're not seeing as much as I kind of thought we would at first.
Okay. How about opportunities to spray if the beetles are present? Are there insecticide options for treatment? Or
there are.
injection or...
Yeah, we don't use anything in the forest. It just isn't, economic. But if you have a landscape tree, you can use bowl sprays. I don't remember the chemicals right offhand, but Dan Gilrain put out a great document. I'm sure it's available on the Cornell Extension page, where he listed some options. The research that has been done kind of pushes more towards bowl sprays than systemics, if I remember right. And so you can, spray and you want to kill any beetle coming in, because remember, if the beetle gets into the phloem, it's inoculating, multiple species of fungi. So potentially, if enough of them get in and you didn't bowl spray, you lose the tree. But if you do well-timed bowl sprays and keep it up, you could protect your tree.
Okay. So Todd wants to know if there's any push by either federal or state agencies for biomass energy markets to incentivize the southern pine beetle and other pest salvage and preventive works. So trying to quit this kind of the current lose-lose of tree waste while expanding fossil fuels. He points out Todd's located in the lower Hudson Valley. There's no low-grade markets in this region for 50 years, and equates this with some of the lack of management happening with fires out west.
Yeah, it's a great point. And, I haven't been involved in a lot of those types of discussions. The area in Rocky Point, for example, was originally sent out as a bid, to see if we could get somebody in there to do the thinnings. This was before the experimental forest or demo forest went in, and nobody bid on it. And there was just, there was no chance of getting somebody in there that could make any type of money. there had been some talk after that about trying to move wood off on a barge and this and that, but it didn't seem like any of the kind of avenues that I know of that people were going down to try to find a use for the wood that they could never get a win, really. And so we've just been left with leaving it on the ground. But to me it screams in the direction that the question is asking. It's like, can't this be used for something somewhere? But it's just, I guess it's just not cost effective to truck it off of the island right now.
Okay. Maybe kind of related to that, Ray wants to know if transporting infested logs to a mill would accelerate the spread of southern pine beetle.
Yeah, we had a lot of discussions about this early on. My sense is probably not. You have a lot going on with these beetles getting established. And so if you were cutting in the middle of the summer, let's say, and then moving those logs to get processed, we certainly wouldn't want a situation where the logs got moved and then sat, next to like adjacent to a pine stand or anything like that, and they sat there for a month before being processed. But if they were moved and processed pretty quickly, I believe it's low risk, because again, you've got the beetles that do survive, they're coming out and there's no signal directing them to another tree. So it is it's not something that we would necessarily want to see a lot of, but it is, in my opinion anyways, a relatively low risk endeavor.
Okay. So here's a question from Jerry Hertel, who worked in the Southern Pine program in the late 70s and 80s. And Texas Forest Service monitoring pheromones, and he wants to know if you're using the clarid southern pine beetle ratio in pheromone traps to determine trends in populations.
Yep, that's a good question. And so we are tracking that. We have not used it. I didn't touch on this. I was going to, and then I didn't. But in the southeast, they'll use a ratio of that claret that I showed you a picture of. Those respond really strongly to the pheromone beta traps, and so you can use a ratio of the southern pine beetle caught and the clarets caught to give you I don't know, it's like a general prediction of the type of damage you might expect in an area. And so we have not been using that just because we're not sure that it's appropriate up here. We are collecting all of those data and then getting them into there's a database that houses all of the information from the southeast that I'm sure he's familiar with. And so we are holding that data. Matt Ayers and Carissa Aoki have as part of one of their grants that was funded by the Forest Service, they're testing some of those numbers up here to see if they are valid. We just have such a different landscape compared to the southeast that I think it may be difficult to use that same type of model here, but we are looking into it.
All right. So lots of people saying excellent presentation. Thank you. Great job. I'm not going to read all of those, but just know that everybody liked it.
Well, I listen. I appreciate that, and these are great questions.
Well, this is so. I was, at 11 o'clock, I looked at the registration database, and there were like 57 people. I'm like, oh man, this is a pretty poor. Kevin's not going to come back anymore. And then there's like 90 people on, so there's a big rush right at the end.
Good.
All right, so let's see. So Kathy says, I guess there's a couple of people talking about that fire from, looks like it was a 1995 fire, and Andrew Messenger is going to be contacting you.
Okay.
Tom Ward says another Dendroctida species, phloem thickness and area in a stand affects brood success. Small diameter young stands have thin phloem layers and less phloem area, and therefore less able to support. Stands are less susceptible. Was that the case with southern pine beetle?
I haven't. I'm familiar with that work on mountain pine beetle, but I don't think that type of relationship has been documented per se for southern pine beetle. I think it would make sense that it would be in a young stand with small trees and thin phloem, that you wouldn't get the same level of brood success as you would in some of the larger trees. On Long Island, or at least in the areas that I've been working in, you don't see a lot of young um, young pitch pine, really. It's all I don't say mature, but larger diameter trees that are out there that southern pine beetles hitting. But most androgynous have that relationship. If there's thin phloem, they have to eat more of it. They have to cover more of an area, so you have less density can even go into the tree, and even less comes out. So I would expect it would be similar.
Okay. So Joel says, in Massachusetts, we have, this is just in response to one of the other questions. In Massachusetts, we've thinned multiple sites in the area of over 1,000 acres. And to my knowledge, they've not had any issues with invasive plants coming in over the last 5 to 10 years. And similarly, they have not had issues with wind throw.
Oh, great.
So,
yeah, I mean, I feel like and this may be just naive on my part of not knowing that type of research as well, but I just feel like we would have seen more of it if we were going to get it, based on those two, I think it was 2 nor'easters that went through there that had really severe winds, and we only saw a few breaks.
mm-hmm. So the soils are relatively sandy, right? I'm assuming.
Yeah.
So you would expect the trees to have pretty good root systems established, and anchor them. So I think, Kevin, you've answered all of the questions. I don't believe I've missed any. There are some just people making some additional comments that for the other viewers to take a look at. So great job. I appreciate this very much. And Kevin will be coming back this evening at 7 o'clock. So if you want to see the same presentation twice, you're welcome to come back. So I need to do that, because I always get something the second time around. So I appreciate
it'll be a mess at 7 o'clock. So nobody should come back.
Well, so all right, Kevin, thank you. And thanks all the participants. Appreciate it very much.
Definitely. Thanks, everybody.